Welcome to the Deep Dive. Okay, today let's unpack this really critical report from the Economic Policy Institute. It's called How Anti-Worker Policies, Crony Capitalism, and Privatization Keep the South Locked Out of Shared Prosperity. We're zeroing in on Rooted in Racism and Economic Exploitation, Part 5. Our mission here is simple. Cut through the complexity and really dissect this economic model you see across the American South. We want to show you its deep historical roots and, well, the huge impact it has on millions of people's lives, often in ways you don't immediately see. The goal is basically to give you a shortcut to understanding a topic that's, frankly, way more important and nuanced than it usually gets credit for.
Yeah, and what's really striking about this report is how it just lays bare this systemic thing. It's an economic development model in the South that, quite deliberately, by design, has consistently favored the wealthy and corporations, often directly at the expense of workers and their families. This isn't just bad luck or, a few mistakes. It's a whole series of specific policy choices that actively create economic precarity. And that precarity helps maintain, well, the existing racial and class hierarchies.
Okay, so if we want to grasp how this model hits people on the ground, where do we see the first sort of tangible effects for workers?
Well, you see it right away with labor protections, or maybe the lack of them. Southern states just consistently have some of the weakest laws in the country for things like wage theft or paid sick leave. And even when there are minimal protections on the books, they're often just not enforced very well.
Not enforced.
Right. Like 7 of the 10 absolute worst states in the U.S. for enforcing wage and hour laws, they're in the South. Think about Mississippi. It has no state wage and hour laws. None. Alabama only regulates child labor. And Florida, huge state, right, doesn't even have a State Department of Labor to investigate violations.
Wow. No state DOL.
Nope. So it creates this environment that's, well, it's basically ripe for exploitation.
Yeah, that's quite something. What about the actual cost?
Yeah.
Like the scale of this wage theft?
Oh, the scale is just staggering, really. If you look at just 4 big southern states, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, you're talking over 800,000 workers. And they collectively lose nearly $3 billion every year.
$3 billion?
Yes. And that's just from minimum wage violations alone. Think about that. Billions of dollars people earned, legally owed to them, just disappearing from paychecks.
Unbelievable.
And here's a really crucial part. Most of these states don't actually recover those stolen wages for the employees. 6 of the 7 states in the whole country that basically don't recover wages, they're southern states.
So what are workers supposed to do?
Well, it forces them to rely on the Federal Department of Labor, which is, incredibly stretched thin. They've only got about 611 investigators for the entire country, all 50 states, the territories.
There's 611 for everyone.
Yeah. Or the other option is trying class action lawsuits. But a lot of workers are barred from even joining those because of forced arbitration clauses in their contracts.
So weak laws, practically no enforcement. It sounds like the system is almost, set up to let this happen.
That's certainly the argument the report makes. It paints a picture where it's not accidental.
And what happens if, say, a city or a county tries to do better? If local communities want to raise wages or improve standards?
Well, that's where another piece comes in. Southern state legislatures very often use something called state preemption laws.
Preemption?
Yeah. It basically means the state government can step in and block local governments, cities, counties from passing their own stronger rules. So even if local folks vote for higher wages, the state can just say, nope, you can't do that.
So they override the local will.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have things like right-to-work policies. These weaken unions because workers can benefit from a union contract without paying dues. Combine that with outright bans on collective bargaining for public employees in many places. It just systematically undermines worker power. It's like a multi-layered strategy to keep labor costs down and workers less organized.
Okay, so the workplace itself is challenging. But you mentioned this goes beyond the job. The report talks about intentional disinvestment in public goods, basically dismantling the safety net, and that this has historical roots.
It absolutely does. And you really can't understand the present without looking at that history. Many of the foundational anti-poverty programs in the U.S. were structured very deliberately to maintain the existing racial hierarchy.
How so?
Well, take the Social Security Act of 1935, a cornerstone, right? It specifically excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers from getting benefits. And who held those jobs disproportionately back then? Black people. So they were cut off from this crucial support system from the start.
Wow. I didn't realize it was that explicit.
Oh, yes. And Southern members of Congress also thought hard to make sure states could administer aid to dependent children. ADC, the precursor to welfare themselves. They even managed to remain a clause that would have required states to ensure a reasonable subsistence with health and decency. This basically gave states, especially Southern states, the power to decide who got aid and how much, often based on race.
Pretty disturbing to see how those historical decisions still seem to shape things today, like with nutrition aid or cash assistance now.
Precisely. There are still these widespread, incorrect public perceptions about who receives welfare, particularly overestimating the share of Black recipients. And these attitudes directly impact political willingness to fund these programs. So what do you see? Southern states consistently spend the least per person on public welfare. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas. They're right there at the bottom nationally.
And things like food stamps, SNP.
Same pattern. SNP participation rates are lower in the South. And incredibly, during the COVID pandemic, 6 Southern states actually turned down extra federal money for SNP, even with people clearly struggling.
Turned down federal money during a pandemic.
Yes. And it wasn't just SNP. Think about school lunches. Over 2/3 of the House Republicans who voted against expanding free school lunches during the pandemic, they represented Southern states.
Okay, what about direct cash help? Like TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. Has that fared any better?
Unfortunately, no. TANF reaches far, far fewer families living in poverty than the programs it replaced. And this decline has been steepest in Southern states that have large Black populations. Nationally, in 2021, only about 20% of eligible families got TANF. But in Texas, it was down to just 4.3%.
4%. That's almost nothing.
It's incredibly low. And the benefit amounts are also the lowest in the South. Like in 2023, a family of 3 in Arkansas, maximum $204 a month. Compare that to over $1,200 in New Hampshire.
That difference is just vast. So if the money isn't going to these families who desperately need it, where is it going? That TANF money.
That is the million-dollar question, or rather billion-dollar question. Because TNF is a block grant, states get a lump sum of money and have a lot of flexibility in how they spend it. Maybe too much flexibility. So the money often gets diverted to things completely unrelated to direct cash aid for poor families.
Like what?
Well, Louisiana uses a big chunk of its TNF grant for college scholarships. Some even go to students from families who wouldn't qualify for cash aid. Georgia spends almost half of its TNF funds on its child welfare system, not direct support to keep families stable in the first place. And then you have the really shocking cases like Mississippi.
I think I heard about this.
Yeah, they illegally spent $77 million in TNF funds. That included $1.1 million to Brett Favre, the former NFL player, for speeches he apparently never even gave, and $5 million for a volleyball stadium at his alma mater.
Using welfare funds for a stadium.
Yes. Money meant for the poorest families. It's a really stark example of how these funds can be misused when oversight is weak.
So with these public supports so weak, or the money being siphoned off, what does that daily struggle look like? Food, housing, basic needs for Southern families.
It means constant economic insecurity, a state of just precariousness. The South has the highest rate of food insecurity in the entire country. Almost 15% households there struggled with food in 2023. States like Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, their rates are significantly higher than the national average.
15%, that's huge. And housing.
Housing is another major crisis point. In places like Florida, Louisiana, Texas, more than half of all renters are cost burden. That means they're spending over 30% of their income just on rent and utilities.
Look at the house, yeah.
And many of the metro areas with the highest rates of cost-burdened renters. They're in the South, especially Florida. Plus, Southern states generally have fewer protections for tenants, so you see higher eviction rates in cities like Richmond, Virginia, or Memphis, Tennessee.
It really paints a picture of families constantly on the edge, doesn't it? Choosing between food and rent. Is housing assistance any easier to get?
Not at all. It's incredibly difficult. Nationally, 3 out of 4 eligible people never receive housing vouchers. They just don't get them. And wait times are longest in many Southern states. 6 of the 9 places where the wait time is over 3 years. Southern states.
3 years waiting for help.
And what's deeply concerning is the racial disparity here, too. 2/3 of the households on waiting lists at the big housing agencies are Black households. And it's not just rentals. We're seeing private equity firms moving aggressively into the Southern housing market.
Private equity buying up houses.
Single-family homes, yeah. Over half of all the private equity-owned housing units in 5 states are concentrated in just 4 Southern states. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas. And they often target Black neighborhoods specifically. This contributes to making home ownership harder and also drives up foreclosure rates, which are higher in the South. Florida and South Carolina were in the top 10 for foreclosures recently.
Okay, so we've got weak labor laws, a frayed safety net, housing insecurity. What about other essential infrastructure? Things like healthcare, childcare, transportation. How have southern states approached those?
Well, the pattern continues, unfortunately. Let's take healthcare. It's really striking how much Southern lawmakers have resisted chances to expand healthcare access, even when the benefits seem obvious. Remember, the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, Florida actually led a lawsuit against it back in 2010, and 6 other Southern states joined in.
Right, I remember that opposition.
And they didn't stop there. 10 Southern state attorneys general and 2 governors sued again in 2018 to try and dismantle it. But here's the irony. Despite all that political opposition, ACA enrollment has actually tripled since 2020 in several Southern states, including some that voted for Trump. People need the coverage.
So the demand is there. What about Medicaid expansion under the ACA? That was supposed to cover more low-income adults.
That's probably the biggest example of resistance. 10 states still haven't expanded Medicaid eligibility. 7 of those 10 are in the South: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas.
7 southern states refusing Medicaid expansion. What's the impact of that decision?
It's devastating. Studies estimate thousands of premature deaths resulted from this choice just between 2014 and 2017, particularly among older adults. And Black individuals are disproportionately harmed because they are more likely to fall into that coverage gap. It also hits hospitals hard, especially rural ones. Far more rural hospitals have closed in southern states that didn't expand Medicaid compared to those that did.
Real life and death stuff. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to childcare. Obviously crucial for working parents. Is the South lagging there too?
Absolutely. The childcare crisis is particularly acute in the South. Now, the dollar cost might seem lower in, say, Mississippi compared to Washington, D.C. But even in Mississippi, a typical family is spending 10% of their income on childcare. That's a huge chunk.
10% is significant.
And efforts to make it more affordable often fail. Bills have died in state legislatures in Florida, Kentucky, West Virginia. Look at Texas. They had a massive state surplus recently. They spent only about 1/10 of it on stabilizing the childcare sector, but they spent over 1/3 of that surplus on property tax cuts that mainly benefit wealthier homeowners and corporations.
Wow. Priorities.
And this hits single-parent households the hardest. They're more common in the South. About 38% of kids live in single-parent homes there. And those families spend, on average, 3 times as much of their income on childcare as married couples do.
About 35% of their income.
35%. That's just unsustainable for most people.
Exactly. It forces impossible choices.
And transportation. You mentioned infrastructure earlier. How do those choices play out? And does history echo here too? It definitely does. Southern states have a reputation for, well, not spending enough on maintaining existing roads. After the federal government provided transportation funding back in 2009, states like Arkansas and Texas used a huge chunk of it, over 45%, to build new highways rather than fix the ones they already had.
Building new roads instead of fixing potholes.
Pretty much. And that trend continues. 6 of the 10 states spending the most federal infrastructure money today on highway expansion there in the South. Georgia's governor recently announced $1.5 billion for roads, but 0 for public transit. Atlanta's public transit system, MARTA, it has literally never received state funding from Georgia.
Never for a major city's transit system.
Never state funds. So they build more roads, neglect repairs, and underfund transit. How does that impact people?
Yeah, how does it affect different communities?
It creates really stark racial disparities. Because of historical segregation patterns and this ongoing disinvestment in urban transit, Black workers and people of color in the South often face worse transit service, longer commutes, and tragically, they're also more likely to be killed in traffic accidents.
That's awful.
In Atlanta, for example, the way highways were originally built displaced communities that were 95% Black. Then, as white residents moved to the suburbs, funding for MARTA suffered, which cut off many Black Atlantans from accessing jobs that had also moved out of the city center.
So transportation policy becomes economic policy?
Yeah.
And reinforces inequality.
Exactly. And it impacts other groups, too. 8 of the 10 states with the highest rates of disability, southern states. And disabled adults are twice as likely to face transportation barriers. Rural residents also suffer. In many southern states, the share of rural folks without access to buses or trains between cities is higher than the national average, and services have been cut significantly in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas.
Okay, so it really feels like all these threads, weak labor laws, poor safety nets, underfunded infrastructure, they all tie back to how states raise and spend money, right? The report talks about a kind of vicious cycle in Southern tax and budget systems.
It absolutely does. And again, you have to look at the history to really get it. The report argues that this strong anti-tax sentiment in the South, it's a direct legacy of slavery.
How so? A legacy of slavery?
Yeah. Enslavers strongly opposed property taxes because enslaved people were considered property. After the Civil War and abolition, these same powerful interests, now calling themselves concerned taxpayers, fought against any efforts to replace the lost revenue that had come from taxing enslaved people. They resisted taxes that could fund public goods, especially education for newly freed Black citizens. Later on, Southern states shifted away from taxes on corporate income and toward sales tax.
Shifting to sales tax.
Which is a regressive move. It means that the tax burden shifts downwards, hitting lower and middle income families much harder than the wealthy.
So what does that look like today for just an average person buying groceries or paying their taxes in the South?
It means they're often paying a much higher share of their income in taxes than rich people are. Southern states have some of the most regressive tax systems in the entire country. That means the poor pay proportionally more. 5 of the 10 most regressive states are Southern: Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Tennessee, Texas.
The most regressive.
And get this. In 11 Southern states, the poorest 20% of people pay more just in sales taxes than the richest 1% pay in all state and local taxes combined.
Wow. Just let that sink in.
Right.
The poorest pay more in sales tax than the richest pay overall.
That's what the data shows. And it has clear racial dimensions, too. In Tennessee, for example, Black and Hispanic families who generally have lower median incomes end up being taxed at a higher effective rate than white and Asian families. And the trend isn't getting better. Several Southern states have actually made their tax systems more regressive in recent years. Florida, which already had the most regressive system, saw its governor propose eliminating all property taxes.
Eliminating property taxes. But doesn't that fund schools?
Exactly. Public schools rely heavily on property taxes. Eliminating them could basically dismantle the public education system.
So, tax the poor, benefit the rich, and collect very little revenue overall. How do these states actually pay for anything then?
Well, that's the thing. They don't collect much revenue per person because of these tax structures and high poverty rates, and because they often fail to tax corporations adequately, so they become incredibly dependent on money from the federal government.
Dependent on federal funds.
Hugely. 7 of the top 10 states that receive more money back from the federal government than their residents pay in federal taxes. They're Southern states. Mississippi gets federal funds equal to about 1/3 of its entire state budget.
1/3? Wow.
But even with that federal help, because their own revenue is so low, they still spend less per person on things like public welfare and education compared to other regions. It just perpetuates the cycle.
And how do they fill the budget gaps? You mentioned fines and fees earlier.
Yes, that's another part of the picture. To make up for the lack of tax revenue, many Southern states rely heavily on non-tax revenue, especially fines and fees. 5 of the 10 states that rely most heavily on fines and fees are Southern, and enforcement of these fines and fees often disproportionately targets Black communities. There are small towns in the South where fines and fees make up half or more of the entire town's revenue.
So rely on D.C., nickel and dime residents with fees, and then I assume corporate subsidies come into play too.
Oh, absolutely. Big time. Southern states give away billions in public money to corporations, direct subsidies, tax breaks. In 2022, almost half of all the corporate mega deals, we're talking deals over $100 million, went to companies locating or expanding in Southern states. That was at least $10.7 billion in subsidies.
$10 billion in 1 year.
And a lot of that goes to specific industries like auto manufacturing. But think about the trade-offs. In South Carolina, school districts lost nearly $3.2 billion to these corporate tax abatements just between 2017 and 2023.
Money lost to schools.
Enough money to hire over 6,600 teachers every year. In Texas, which gave away $1.23 billion in subsidies in 2022 alone, you find 49 of 52 school districts in the whole country where the loss per student due to these deals is over $1,000 a year.
just draining resources from schools to give to corporations.
And they often block ways to ensure these deals actually benefit local workers. Things like project labor agreements, PLAs, which set wage standards, or community benefits agreements, CBAs, which might guarantee local hiring. Some states, like Alabama and Tennessee, even have laws preventing companies from getting state funds if they voluntarily recognize a union or agree to a CBA.
It really feels like a system designed to keep costs low for business, no matter the cost to communities or workers.
That's the core argument of the report.
So when you've hollowed out public services, underfunded everything, and given breaks to corporations, the report suggests the ultimate solution offered is often privatization. What does that look like in the South?
Yeah, privatization is presented as the cure-all, but the report argues it often means replacing public services with for-profit options that are actually worse, more expensive, and definitely less equitable. A key example is private school vouchers.
Vouchers, right.
The push for vouchers has deep roots in the history of resisting school desegregation in the South. After the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, private school enrollment soared in the South, and these schools often served almost exclusively white students. Decades of research show vouchers generally don't improve student outcomes. Sometimes they even make them worse. But they absolutely divert billions in public tax dollars away from public schools to private schools, which are often religious and lack accountability. Florida is a prime example, spending huge amounts on these subsidies.
So education gets privatized? What about other social programs?
Well, Southern Republicans have often been leading the charge to privatize huge federal programs like Medicare and Social Security. And look at what happened when Texas tried to outsource its SNIP eligibility process, determining who gets food stamps to a private for-profit company back in 2006.
What happened?
It was a disaster. Thousands of people were wrongly denied benefits they were entitled to, and there were huge delays for those who did eventually get approved. It caused immense hardship.
That's incredibly concerning.
Mm-hmm.
And the report points to another area where privatization is rampant and has, again, Southern roots: the criminal legal system.
Yes, this is a really stark and disturbing part of the story, the privatization of punishment. Southern states have always incarcerated more people in private prisons compared to other regions, and while some states are moving away from private prisons, several southern states, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, have actually increased their use significantly since 2000. Some have 15% or more of their prison population in private facilities.
And it's not just the prisons themselves, right?
No, it's the whole ecosystem around incarceration. You have prison retailing. Private companies charge absolutely exorbitant prices for basic things inside prisons and jails, phone calls, commissary items, banking services. Meanwhile, incarcerated workers in the South are paid the lowest wages in the country, often less than 20 cents an hour. So they can't even afford these overpriced necessities.
Profiting at every turn.
Exactly. And then there's private probation, the idea of for-profit companies supervising people on misdemeanor probation. That started in the South. 7 of the 12 states that rely on these private probation companies are Southern. Georgia is a major example. 80% of its courts use private probation, and the state actually prohibits the public probation system from supervising misdemeanors. There's very little transparency. The fees charged to probationers are often higher, and these companies face constant lawsuits for abusive practices.
Just layer upon layer.
And one more piece: immigrant detention. The anti-immigrant policies ramped up under the Trump administration really breathed new life into the private prison industry, especially along the southern border and the Gulf Coast. Louisiana is now sometimes called Detention Center Alley. Local jails make huge profits by renting bed space to ICE, immigration, and customs enforcement. They can get paid something like $74 per day for an ICE detainee, compared to maybe $25 for someone incarcerated on a state charge. It creates a perverse incentive. So if you connect all these dots, the weak labor laws, the frayed safety nets, the regressive taxes, the corporate giveaways, the privatization, it becomes really clear, doesn't it? This Southern economic model, as described in the report, it just fundamentally does not serve most workers, families, or communities. It hasn't produced stronger growth overall, it hasn't led to widespread prosperity, and it hasn't resulted in better health or education outcomes compared to other regions.
It's a powerful critique. But as we've discussed, this deep dive really shows this isn't inevitable, right? It's not some kind of natural phenomenon. These are the outcomes of very specific, intentional policy choices made over a long period, rooted in a particular history. So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for the future? Not just for the South, but maybe for all of us.
Well, the report ends with a really thought-provoking, almost cautionary statement. It says, As the South goes, so goes the nation. The argument is that this model, this combination of anti-worker policies, disinvestment, and privatization, it's not staying confined to the South. Elements of it are being replicated elsewhere. So it leaves you with a pretty important question, doesn't it? If the South, with its incredibly complex and often painful history, could actually choose to dismantle these policies, to genuinely invest in all its people, if that could happen there, what does that suggest about the potential for real positive change, for building genuine shared prosperity across the entire country?